Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call to order the Cabarrus County Board of Commissioners. Put that down and turn it over to County Manager.
Okay, well, thank you. We appreciate everybody being here for this special called meeting. I know it wasn't easy to get here, and the opportunity to present to you as requested by the board, an additional 5-year plan, and do some of the discussion that goes along with that. I'm going to start off with a message, and it's going to sort of be a tag team presentation between myself and Pam and Ann and Parth and Jonathan, and I think that's about it that's going to be presenting. But we'll be moving around a little bit to hopefully make sure that we point out what we're referring to. Just some logistics. The 3 plans that we're talking about are going to be up here. Some of the screens will show that. Then also for you in the audience, if you want to get up and move around, feel free to walk in the back, or those same plans are back there. So if you want to do that during the meeting, or if there's a break required, then you can do that as well. So before we start, I just wanted to start off with a message, and then we'll open it up, and then we'll go back into the process of how did we get here today, all the way back to last year's budget, into the board retreat, and then where we are today, and then what comes after today. What do we need to do? What does the board need to do? And then how do we move forward from there and to ultimately adopt a budget? So to start, again, I would like to appreciate the opportunity for the staff to provide input into the proposed 5-year plan and the fiscal year 2015 general budget process. Before we begin, I'd like to give some background on the process of developing and implementing the 5-year plan and the general fund budget. The 5-year plan is an instrument that was created by staff several years ago to provide the board an opportunity to consider not only the current year budget, but to get an idea of the potential impacts and needs that are known at the point in time for the next 4 years. Interpreting the plan correctly is very important. The first year of the plan is a reflection of the current year budget that the board adopted or is currently considering. The remaining 4 years are predictions designed to help set a strategic direction. The 5-year plan is a budget forecast that allows staff to provide the board with estimated numbers and a frame of reference as to its impact on the budget in the coming years. These projected amounts include expected revenues, additional current expenses, and capital needs of the county and school systems. The 5-year plan also provides a property tax rate that will be required to fund those ensuing years if the board chooses to take on additional operating and/or capital expenses. With the understanding that years 2 through 5 are only forecast, it's important to consider the many variables that can impact the outlook: changes in the economy, board priorities, school and county capital needs, and growth and decline in the tax base can also have a positive or negative impact on those future budgets and the amount of revenues and the tax rate needed to fund them. At the annual Board of Commissioners retreat in January, staff presented several variations of the 5-year plan for the board to consider, including a plan proposed by Commissioner Osterreich. The plans created by the staff included detailed revenue and expense projections based on expert opinion, state recommendations, and historical data, and included a tax rate of 70 cents, which would be needed to continue to fund county programs and services at their current and projected levels. The 70-cent tax rate was extended throughout the 5 years for planning purposes only, as the board directs the staff each year of their wishes concerning the tax rate. Projected for 2017 in that 5-year plan, the 70-cent tax rate would have produced an estimated $6.7 million in additional revenues that would allow the county to fund capital projects, mostly schools that were put on hold for a 5-year period by the Board of Commissioners due to the poor economy and resulting lack of funds to support the capital projects. The remaining fund balance gives the board flexibility in determining which projects to fund, using any combination of cash, installment purchase, limited obligation bonds, and general obligation bonds as they see fit. County staff proposed general obligation bonds, or GO bonds, based on direction given by the board several years ago, to have a publicly supported referendum before acquiring any new debt. Upon review of the several five-year plan options presented at the retreat, staff requested direction from the board as to how they would like to move forward in preparation of the fiscal year 2015 budget. Without additional direction at that time or input from the board, staff proceeded with the normal budget preparation process with the understanding that an increase in property tax rate is not an option for fiscal year 2015. We'll talk a little bit about the fund balance. And the fund balance, or the sum of excess revenues over expenditures for the entity, whether they're restricted, committed, or assigned. The Board of Commissioners have a policy that directs all funds to the capital reserve at year end, with the exception of the required 15% balance used to maintain appropriate cash flow for normal county operations, funds reserved or assigned for potential legal issues and/or tax appeals, and emergency contingencies. The redirected funds are committed to current and future capital needs of the county and school systems. Due to the economic downturn, the board waived the policy and did not transfer these funds between fiscal year 2009 and fiscal year 2013. In doing this, the county created a temporary cash reserve to protect itself from uncertainty and the volatility of the economy. As the economy began to improve, the capital needs of the county and the growth needs of the schools also continued to grow. Staff intended to recommend to the board to move forward transferring the accumulated funds of the temporary cash reserve into the capital reserve fund. This could fund projects, including a new elementary school in the Northwest area, several schools that needed large roof projects that have leaked for quite a while and have been getting short-term fixes over the years, and then finally the Rowan Cabarrus Community College Cosmetology Center. Additional county projects were awaiting available funding as well. The Board of Commissioners did move forward with the 5-year accumulation of funds that were in the general fund balance to the capital reserve to fund the elementary school in the northwest part of Cabarrus, and the Mount Pleasant Middle School replacement project. Those projects are moving forward as the board has directed. The annual budget process is taken very seriously by the staff. Beginning in November of each year, our department heads begin to review their capital needs in order to maintain and/or expand their facilities and services. These projected needs are submitted in December. Immediately following, our departments begin their process of evaluating their current programs and services to ensure that they are meeting the intended goals and objectives of the Board of Commissioners and their internal departmental needs. Department heads then evaluate their programs from a financial perspective, determining whether they are operating as efficiently as possible while maintaining the expected demands of the public. Following the departmental review and preparation, the department budgets are submitted to our finance department for review. This is the first point in the process where individual department budgets are reviewed in a more comprehensive manner, taking into account the collective needs of the county, the school systems, and outside agencies that depend on us for funding. Department head and other agencies are then required to present their proposed budgets to county management. In most cases, any new staffing requests, new programs, or additional services must be at least partially, but preferably totally funded with new revenues. Upon completion of these meetings, county management crafts a recommended budget for the presentation to the Board of Commissioners in May, with required public hearing at the Board of Commissioners regular meeting in June, and approval by the Board of Commissioners no later than June 30th. Staff is currently working through this process and is looking forward to presenting a recommended budget in May. And why are we here today? Charge to county management. On March 17, 2014, county management was charged by the Board of Commissioners by a board motion to craft and present a 5-year plan that meets certain parameters described in the board's motion at its meeting in March. These guidelines are Guideline 1 was to place the following 3 projects and the amounts on the proposed bond list. There's $9 million for Rowan Cabarrus Community College Advanced Technology Center, $11 million for Royal Oaks Elementary School replacement, and $23 million for the Kannapolis City Schools Middle School. Guideline 2, the bond list will be drafted very specifically such that if alternative financing is provided for any of these 3 projects, financing pursuant to the bond will no longer be available. Guideline 3, RCCC will receive an additional $2 million in cash for the Advanced Technology Center at the time of financing. Guideline 4, provide short-term financing of up to $23 million to Kannapolis City Schools in fiscal year 15 for a term not to exceed 5 years for its middle school, provided that Kannapolis City Schools withdraw its resolution in support of the bond referendum by May 31st. If Kannapolis City Schools does not make such withdrawal, no other project will be added to the bond project list, and the total amount of the bond will be reduced by $23 million. Guideline 5, the fiscal year 15 budget 5-year plan will have the following: a revenue-neutral tax rate for the revaluation year, an additional $2 million in cash for Mount Pleasant Middle School, $1.5 million in cash for the Rowan Cabarrus Community College Cosmetology Program relocation. Staff has worked very hard since that meeting to prepare this plan as directed by the Board of Commissioners and to meet the required conditions. This required staff to expedite our departmental review process in order to get the information needed to craft the plan in such a short period. Although we have now met with all of the departments prior to today's meeting, we have not included some of their information in our presentation because of the need to prepare our presentation in a timely manner. So, as prior to last Monday, we had met with most of them, and we did a cutoff date on the numbers. We did, since the last meeting, meet with those others, but we didn't include their numbers because they weren't included in your handout. So we will add those at a later time. You will note that our presentation includes 2 plans to meet the different options presented in the Board of Commissioners motion. The options are due to the impending decision by the Kannapolis City School Board concerning their proposed middle school and whether it will be included in the bond referendum promotion passed by the Board of Commissioners. The plans prepared by staff according to the parameters of the motion will require cuts into the county operations during fiscal year 16 and 17. This will negatively impact our ability to provide the current programs and services expected by the public. It will also require budget reductions in operational line items as well as staffing. I also need to note that the impact of these plans will stretch beyond county operations. There will be several unmet needs, and we will present these later, especially some of the needs of the schools, which will go unmet because of these plans' lack of available funds. In closing, staff has prepared the information as required by the motion approved by the Board of Commissioners, and for this I thank them. The time constraints were very demanding, as they also manage responsibilities related to the normal budget process. As I stated before, all of the proposed plans, C, E, and F, will require deep cuts into the county's operational budget. These cuts are not temporary, they are long-term or recurring cuts. For our normal process, we will continue to refine and improve our existing services, but in some cases we may need to expand others to meet the needs and expectations of our citizens, current and those moving here every day. These cuts and increased demands on service will come at a time when already cut budgets over the last several years to a point that many of our departments had to reduce staff, operating funds, and operational hours, resulting in reduced services to the public. Our department heads have offered reductions to help meet the needs for fiscal year 2015 budget, and those will impact services as well. Meeting Plan C will require additional cuts in fiscal year 15 and 16, while meeting plans E and F will require more reductions in fiscal year 16 and 17. With the economy beginning to improve and our population continuing to increase, it is a critical time to define our county's expectation of service levels, standards of quality of life, and our community as a whole. And with that, we'll move into our presentation, We're going to start with Ms. Ann Wilson, our Finance Director, and she, as I said, is going to take us back to last year's budget, approved and amended, and how we got to the point where we are today. We're going to go from the budget approval process to the retreat until we are today, and then we'll show where we start all three plans with the same number, and we've moved forward from there. Okay?
Thank you. Well, my section of the presentation is quite number-oriented and technical, but it's intended to provide information on our process. We examine one-time revenues and expenditures and remove them, and then we reevaluate in preparation for both the retreat and then again at the budget time. So this includes a review of our current year revenue and expenses to ascertain how we're doing with the current year, as well as trying to establish what we think will happen with current year in terms of fund balance, and also in order to improve our projections for the coming year. So the first slide shows us starting with $200,267,199. That was the general fund adopted budget in FY13. And for the audience that may not know, a fiscal year starts on July 1 and ends on June 30th. So when I say FY13, that would have been 7/1 of 12 to 6/30 of 13. So fiscal 14 is 7/1 of 13 to 6/30 of 14. So let's roll forward 13 to where we are now. The first item was an addition of $1,941,342, and that was new personnel due to increased demand. Now, we're doing the expense side. The net cost of that personnel was $912,370, which means there was roughly $1 million in revenue to offset this expense, making the net cost. But looking at just the expenses, they did increase $1,941,342. The next item was the increase in the health insurance cost, a 1.5% COLA and a 1.25% average merit. Like I say, the cost of $1,945,000. Now, that is per the BOC policy, which for the first time since 2009, both the COLA and the merits were offered. The next amount is $2,276,765, and that was an appropriation for the schools for current expense. The next item was $658,756, and that was to assist the Cabarrus Health Alliance. $300,000 of that was a one-time amount, but that's the total amount of the increase appropriated to them in fiscal 14. The next item is $1,198,936, which was an increase in the Board of Commissioners contingency. And the reason that was so large was because the contingency held funding for the potential state salary increase that had been expected, and for anticipated changes in the ADM, which is the average day membership, which is the number of children in schools. The next item was $1,151,217, and that was the change in the economic tax incentives expected for that year. The next amount is a decrease of $1,024,177 in debt service. And then there was $619,000 in miscellaneous changes, some up, some down, netting the $619,000. So that gets us to the general fund adopted budget at fiscal year 14 of $213,461,012. Now, for the retreat, we had already entered into that, and so I'm taking us up to December 4th, which was the numbers I used for the retreat. So we start with the 213. There had been $5 million in fund balance appropriated. Most of that was reappropriations from last year. And then there was $475,000 in grant revenue, and this is the corresponding expense side. The reappropriation is when funds were not expended for a particular project in one year, and so you reappropriated them in August and September of the next fiscal year to continue to fund the project until it finished. And then there was the $475 in miscellaneous grant revenue and corresponding expenses. So at the time of the retreat, we were dealing with a budget of $218,947,104. That was the general fund revised budget on 12/4. All right, so we sat down and said, okay, it's budget time. Now what do we do? Excuse me.
One question about slide number 9. For health insurance cost, increase in health insurance cost, that is not paid out of our operating budget, is it? Doesn't that go out of that health insurance fund?
Well, we incur expenses within the general fund for the health insurance, and then those funds are transferred to the health insurance self-insured fund.
Okay.
All righty. Okay, so we're at the 218 from the retreat. Okay, the first thing we do, as I mentioned earlier, is to take off the one-time fundings. And so if you can see it easily on the 5-year plan that was approved in 14, the two non-recurring items. We separate all of our expenses and revenues into what is recurring and what is non-recurring. So the one-time or non-recurring of the $4,203,000, which was one-time funding for CIP, and the $222,911, which was the unemployment funding, which was one time for last year, were coming out. Then the fund balance appropriations, everything that we had appropriated fund balance for, because that's a one-time thing, all of those expenses were pulled out. Then we took an additional $750,000 in operational reductions. Then we took an additional $425,000 in capital outlay reductions. Most of those were motor vehicles. We removed the fuel, legal, and Medicaid contingencies, which was $260,000, and we're counting on all of that being taken care of by the $400,000 Board of Commissioners contingency. So we removed $260,000 of other contingencies. Then we took out $175,000 of temporary personnel in the Human Services Department. So that got us down to $207,901,085. And what you're going to see on these 5-year plans, that is the beginning expense number on all 3 plans. So you can see that they've already had a lot of things cut out of them from the very beginning. But that ties you to this beginning number on that plan. Okay. So now let's look at the plan a little bit more. As we go down the fiscal 15 column, you will see a plus $290,577 for new personnel due to increased demand. Now, those personnel relate to the EMS co-station, to revaluation, to a plan reviewer, and to a custodian. Now, although the Board of Commissioner policy provides for COLAs and merits, those costs are not included in plans E and F. The next item is $234,000 for the increase in health insurance brought about by the Affordable Care Act. The next item is $115,000, which is a result of a partial salary study adjustment, a salary alignment, and that will be discussed at the May meeting. You will have an agenda item for that one, as well as the next item I'm going to talk about for the May meeting. We had not made a workers' comp contribution in quite a while, and this provides for a $300,000 reinstatement of the workers' compensation contribution. The next item is $1,974,059 in reductions of operational expenses and delayed maintenance projects. Then we have the $262,921, which was the planned retirement of debt service, and a $286,818 planned retirement of the school debt service. Those items are always in our 5-year plan.
And can you go back to one slide? The 1.974, that is the product of you meeting with departments?
Yes. Yes. Would you like some detail on kinds of cuts
No,
there?
yeah, I just wanted to make sure that's what that was.
Yes.
That's the process, your normal process that we've already.
Right.
Is that delayed maintenance in county, the county, not schools?
It's, I don't know the detail, but I think it is going to be, what we try to do is going to be A, B, and C projects. Sometimes we are able to get all the A and some of Bs. What probably may have happened is we pushed some of the B, all of the Bs and Cs were off the table, and we only are doing As.
But those are just county facilities.
Those are
Those are the
just
county.
Not, those don't include school
But
projects.
what's it gonna cost us in the long run to put it off?
Well, it's it depending on the project, it could cost more in the future if we have to wait and the system goes down, or if we have to continue to repair it. Some of those projects are going to be described a little bit further in some of these.
Okay, I was going to say, do you have one or two examples of something that might be included in that? Or maybe that's coming later.
In the building and grounds types of
Right.
cuts? Jonathan, any of the detail on that?
That's approximately $360,000 of some delayed maintenance.
They can be anything from, chillers that we think we're able to extend the life on another year with additional maintenance, those kind of things. We analyze each one of them. We don't want to ask you or recommend that you delay something that's ultimately just going to cost us a whole lot more if we delay it. So we look at them and see if we can efficiently delay that cost another year.
Do you know what the cost is to maintain it for another year versus replacing it now?
I don't. That's something, that specific Kyle Billifer would need to give you that information.
We can get you those numbers.
Well, according to the GAO, federal government, for every dollar you delay in maintenance, it costs you $4 when you do get it done. So that's not a very sensible thing to be putting off, I don't think.
Do you want me to proceed?
Yes.
Okay. The next item on the list is $279,783, which was the planned change in economic development incentive grants. The next item was $43,700, which was the planned change in the TIF obligation to the city of Kannapolis. And then there was an increase of $2,096,020, which was the board-approved 1% raise for school employees earning less than $70,000 per year. This was approved mid-year, as you will recall, but then when we annualize it, it's roughly $2.1 million hitting fiscal 15. Then we have the planned Cabarrus Health Alliance one-time allocation coming out of $300,000. We have the planned decrease to the Board of Commissioners contingency to $400,000. And then we have $1,220,000, which is the planned annual capital outlay to Cabarrus County Schools, Kannapolis City Schools, and the Rowan Cabarrus Community College. So that gets you to $208,352,927, and that is the general fund budget in plans E and F.
And C.
Can't see.
The C also had those same reductions.
Yes,
There's
C
a
had the
typo
same
on the slide.
reductions. There was one change in C which relates to the tax rate. So the total budget's somewhat, a little bit different, but for fiscal 15, those expenses are the same on all, the ones I've noted are the same on all three plans, I believe. Now,
There
Any
was one slide.
questions?
There was one slide, about 3 slides back with the grid. That one there.
yes, I want to talk about this. We were talking about how every year we have to take a look at how the current year revenues and expenses are going to see what we might have in fund balance. And this is a chart of the change in our fund balance net of reappropriation. So what we did was we took our audits, we took the final fund balance, and then we looked to see what actually had to be reappropriated, which in essence was it's not really money left over, it's just you didn't get the project done on time, so next year you reappropriate it. So these are net of those things. And you can see that it goes up and down. In fiscal 08, we had a loss. of a little over $4 million. In fiscal 12, we just about broke even. And then for fiscal 13, we had an increase in revenues over expenditures of around 15 million. So you can see it's an up and down thing. So
I'm pretty sure that fiscal year 12, we had it went from 14 to 25, and we spent $9 million on the jail refinance. I think it was a $14 million surplus in fiscal year 12, if I'm not mistaken. We just used it. We spent that money on a refinance, but we did have a surplus that was not zero. I remember Commissioner Burridge asking about that.
yeah, the 14 million, according to this, was in 10. And 09, the change in fund balance was 3.7 million.
I'm
And-
talking about 12. You have it listed as zero. I know that it was, I remember in talking about the.
12, it's 12 was 2,019,000 was the change, and then part.
But that was a net change. That was a net change, and we had refinance. We paid off the jail with our surplus. That was $9 million. So it was a almost $12 million surplus that year that's not included on that sheet.
But after, this is the change in fund balance. So once
Yeah.
you made those payments, it reduced the fund balance.
Right.
So that's the net of what happened to fund balance.
Okay. But in terms of having a surplus for that year, we had a significant surplus in 12 that.
Which was, we had a surplus,
Yeah.
and then we spent money to pay off the debt, which made the fund balance number go into the negative. Any other questions? I know this is a lot of numbers and a lot to throw at you. But hopefully that gets you to an understanding of how we started the plan and the process that we used and what fiscal 15 has in it and doesn't have in it.
Okay, I'm going to start the next section, and this will be the relationship between the guidelines and the plans. Mr. Downs began this presentation by going over the guidelines, and each plan must meet these guidelines, and the next following slides will express how each plan meets those. So for guideline number 1, the 3 projects were proposed at $43 million. They are being financed in different ways. Plan F and C finance them in the same fashion, where Plan E finances everything on a GO bond. A GO bond is voted on by the public. That is how that goes through, and that's what we're talking about for a referendum this fall. What's considered COPS and LIBs is more like a mortgage on your home. It's a private placement of a loan with a bank or with another financial institution. So those are the 2 different options that we have as far as financing is concerned. But each of the 3 plans actually meet the criteria for guideline number 1. Guideline number 2 was the bond list draft specifically such that if alternative financing is provided for any of these 3 projects, financing pursuant to the bond vote will no longer be available. North Carolina General Statute 159.54 and 159.62D govern the contest of a GO bond order and related ballot questions for the voters. They each provide sufficient flexibility to define the bonds project to the effectively restrict projects and the maximum bond amounts, so we can meet the very first criteria where it says bond listed draft. However, there is no provision in NCGS 159.54 or 159.61D that permits the inclusion of a revocation, termination, or similar language if alternative financing is provided for the project. So that is not a viable option.
Well, it doesn't need to be included as a specific statement, but you can draft the bond in such a manner that it says to effectively restrict projects, and that's all that I'm asking for right there in the language. Sufficient flexibility to define the bond projects to effectively restrict the projects.
Okay, because the financing pursuant to the bond vote will no longer be available. It's restricted in that language.
Right, but according to the top provision, if you draft the bond in such a manner that it is for Royal Oaks Elementary, then if we provide alternative financing for Royal Oaks Elementary, we're not going to go back and use it for building a new courthouse. That is all that is required, and so you can meet both of those requirements.
And the NCGF 159.63 will allow you to repeal the bond prior to issuing any GO bond or debt. So It can be done as another alternative, it just can't be done in the initial language. So wanted to provide you with that ability to do that.
It clearly can be done. We're not looking for a specific statement. It can be done right there in the language. Sufficient flexibility to define the bond projects to effectively restrict the projects. That's all that we've asked for. It clearly can be done.
That's fine. Move on to the next slide. Guideline number 3 was to provide additional funding for $2 million for the construction of the facility at the time of financing. This was the $2 million needed for RCCC. I think we missed a couple of words, okay. Plan E funds it in FY16 in the one-time funding section, which would be down here. Plan F funds it through, if Kannapolis were to choose not to be on the bond referendum and we would do a financing a year early, we would reimburse ourselves for that architects and engineering fees and then take that money and move it over to RCCC. And Plan C uses accumulated cash proceeds, which are down in the purple zone on Plan C on the other side of the room. And that's where the funding comes from for that project. So they all meet that criteria. Guideline number 4, Kannapolis City Schools selects option to pull out of the bond referendum. This is the reason why there are 2 plans, a Plan E and a Plan F. One of them presents, Plan E presents it as if it were 2 different debt issues, very similar to the way Plan C does, and Plan F presents it as if every project stays on the bond referendum. So all three plans meet this criteria. Guideline number 5 had several options, revenue neutral tax rate, $2 million funding for Mount Pleasant Middle School, and $1.5 million for funding for the RCC Center. All the plans meet those criteria. E and F are meeting that criteria through the excess fund balance for FY14 that's been projected at $5.5 million. And Plan C meets it from the accumulated cash in the purple section, which is down here at the bottom of Plan C on the other side. From our phone conversation with the local government commission when we were going through the preliminary phone call, we were advised that in order to do financing, bids actually have to be in hand, that you cannot utilize estimates. So architect and engineering funding now has to be upfronted. It can be upfronted via cash, it can be upfronted via a bond anticipation note, but we have included for all 3 plans being able to assess that we have provided the funding to provide those design fees for all the projects, which totals $3.9 million. So the additional current expense that the schools needed to open the Northwest Area Elementary School is included in all 3 plans. Plan E and F have addressed some additional funding for building and grounds maintenance, and that was an option that staff put into their plans. And it's for schools for building and grounds maintenance, and it's not in Plan C. It's just an option that staff took on their own accord. So that's just a comparison of how these are done. You can see the cost for additional current expense and architect and engineering, like I said, on the face of the document and down in this area, and the accumulated cash numbers are in the purple zone for the Plan C. There's been a lot of discussion about the accumulated cash balances that are being projected for these plans. So effective June 30th, 2019, which is the final year of the 5-year plans, all the cash balances have been tallied up to what is left to move forward into the next fiscal year. Based on how Plan E is established, there would be $14.6 million. Based on how F is established, there would be $20.2 million. And based on Plan C, there would be almost $30.1 million. $30,100,000, excuse me. Now, each of the plans has a cost to implement, and they have effects on our operations and services. These reductions will be permanent to make the plan sustainable. For Plan E, and they are in the pink, it will be a cut to 16 and 17, totaling $2.6 million. For Plan F in the pink, it's $5.2 million. And for Plan C in 15 and 16, it's $12.5 million. Okay, the options for reductions. We've evaluated, basically there's only two methods of making reductions to your budget. And one is to take your expenditures and to make a cut in the percentage of what's in those line items. You can do that by the type of expense, like salary, wages, fuel, office supplies, or you can do it by department. The other reduction method is to reduce programs and services based on the board, reduce programs and services, and we will have some specifics related to that based on the board retreat direction and a program matrix concept. So first, for across the board. The total additional reductions required over the 5-year plans, excluding mandated and contractual obligations for services that are mandated and required by the state for us to prepare to expend money on, and any debt service and any contractual obligations, those have been removed from the balance in which you can make your reductions. So for Plan E, it would be a 1.78% reduction to anything that is not in the mandated section of the matrix or a contractual obligation, like economic incentives. You cannot not fund those since you have a contractual obligation. Similarly, Plan F will require a 3.48% reduction, and Plan C would require an 8.33% reduction. Staff is not making this recommendation. Over the last several years, staff has strived to reduce funding to the baseline levels for all programs. Any further reductions may impact programs and services and their respective staff, and lower funding levels cannot ensure that departments meet their established missions, goals, and objectives which were defined by the board. To give you a reason more to substantiate this, I would like to give you a historical perspective of two different time frames of what has happened to the county's budget. And this would be from fiscal 13, that was the adopted budget, and how we get to fiscal 15 as of March 27th. There's an addition of $44,000 to debt service, and that is the change in the financing for the Q-scabs, where the federal government took away part of the subsidy on the interest payments, and we had to include that. In the same time period, excuse me, we've increased school funding by $4,372,000. We've retired debt service of $2,073,000. We have cut operational expenditures of $1.2 million. We have added current staff of $2,594,000. We have new staff costs, and that would be staff who are currently here, and anything related to a COLA, insurance cost increase, anything related to benefits of $2,257,000. We have $1.4 million in economic incentives. Board contingency had a $394,000 increase over this time period, and then the remainder of all the other expenditures was $351,000. So this is the impact and effect of what we have done to our budget from 13 to 15. So you can see that we've reduced operational expenditures and we've cut debts, of course debt service, but that's naturally from the retirement of making the payments. So where we've increased our funding is to the education and to staff and economic incentives, excuse me. If we flip to the next slide. I went back further because there was I noticed there was a different impact from FY11 to FY15, and that gets us through a great deal of the recession. So we added $12 million, $12.1 million, almost $12.2 million to debt service for various projects in which we actually had financing for. The schools have received $6.7 million in additional funding. We've retired $7.7 million in debt service the old-fashioned way. The $9.5 million is not included in here because it was extraordinary and it would have really messed up statistics. We have cut operational expenses by $5.3 million. The effect of current staff cost over that same time period was $704,000. We had two different rifts that the county experienced. We had 77 detention officers that we had to hire to open the new jail facility. So 76 positions in the county's budget were reduced in order to facilitate that during the economic downturn. Then, as the economic downturn continued, excuse me, we had a little over $2 million worth of salary reductions because building inspections went down, registered deeds went down, planning went down, and that's the best I can remember of the big areas that we had. But we did a great deal of restructure, reorganization within our county to compensate for the changes in the service levels that were going on within the county. The new staff that were added was $5.9 million off of that same time period, and $3 million of that is the 77 detention officers. And then the remainder of the $1.9 million that Ann referred to was roughly human services and the sheriff's office for changes there. Economic incentives only changed about $206,000 over that same time period, and board contingency increased over $1,059,000. The biggest part of that would be because of what Ms. Wilson explained before. We did not know whether the state was going to propose the 1% salary increase, and if you put it in current expense, you can't take it back. So we put it in contingency to keep our flexibility there. There was also concerns of whether or not the ADM number would have been way out of whack and we would not have had money in case they had excessive needs. So we had that number in there also. But this is just to explain to you that across the board cutting expenditures has been done numerous times, and we are to a point where the biggest part of where your funding changes have been are in school funding, debt service, the detention center basically as far as new staff is concerned, and very little bit in economic incentives. So those are the basic areas in which we see where funding has changed over the last several years.
Pam, one question about the board contingency, and you said that was related to state salary increases. That is our portion of the school positions that we fund locally, is that correct?
That was inclusive of the 1% salary increase that they proposed. It was also ADM money. It was a multitude of a bunch of different numbers, and the state did not award the school employees that salary increase, so we did not utilize that money.
So that would have been our portion of keeping the employees we pay on even scale with the employees that the state pays.
Yes, sir.
And so we did not do that, so that contributed to the overage that we had at the end of the year, one of
Yes.
those years.
Yes, that's
Right.
and contributed to part of this year's.
We wound up using part of it this year when you did fund their raise, and that was there, and so we used that to
Right.
fund that this year.
Great, thank you.
Pam, I guess the only other comment that I would make, if you look at that list, you see that our increasing of debt service basically is equal to every other thing that we've increased. And that's one of the things we're trying to avoid. I mean, adding $12 million to our debt service really prohibits us from being able to address a lot of our needs. A lot of that debt service was related to the jail, wasn't it?
It was related to jails and 4 schools. 2009 COPS issue was 4 brand new schools, and a wing addition at A.L. Brown, and a renovation of a wing addition, and then some QSCAB money.
Yeah, at least 50% of it was related to the jail, though, wasn't it?
Jail was 08.
I can't answer that question off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
I think the jail was funded with COPS of 08, so that wouldn't have been part of an increase between 11 and
The housing unit would have been in this time period, though. The admin building and the annex would not, but the housing unit most likely would have been in that time period. And that was 50-ish, 50, 60 million-ish that we borrowed off the top of my head for that part of the project. So this was just, the purpose behind this was to give you an understanding of where staff feels. We've done our due diligence, we've cut operational expenditures, we assess, we evaluate them, and we are to a point where across the board cuts are not effective. All they're going to do is disrupt the services that currently are going on. So if the goal and the objective is to go down this road, then we need to address it in a different fashion, and that is to evaluate services and programs. Okay, thank you. Get myself caught up here again. got ahead of myself. Forgive me. Okay. During the retreat in January, we did a dot matrix exercise, and what we did was we had the board prioritize county programs that were considered essential and non-essential, and each commissioner was given a colored dot to vote and make their decision on which programs they felt were essential and non-essential. And based on their guidelines, there were some programs that did not receive the majority vote. So staff considered these programs would be the first ones to be reduced across all the plans. The Cabarrus Health Alliance Administration contribution was the very first one that we have listed on here. This is not the total amount of that contribution, and Ms. Wilson can explain the maintenance of effort and why we can't cut the full amount, but there is a maintenance of effort requirement by the state.
They just came out with it, that we must fund at a minimum at the same levels we funded in FY11. And so I did the calculation, and that's the increase over 11 that we are funding. So that's the maximum amount of cut we could do there. And I believe you meant to say these are in no particular order, these are in alphabetical order.
But thank you, they are exactly in alphabetical order. And these are potential reductions. But basically on how we establish the order in which we're presenting them, we went with the board guidance from that retreat to start off in here. The Community Alternative Program did not receive more than 2 votes, and that would be a net effect to the county budget of $26,754. The Community Development Division, $181,487, and all these numbers are net of the revenues that affect them, that are generated. The Food Policy Council Program, $6,175. The General Assistance Program, and $63,000 of that is for monies that Human Services used for people who fall in between guidelines of the state and don't have enough money for particular issues, but it also is inclusive of one position. And the Waste Reduction and Recycling Division, $156,116, and that's the reduction of 2 staff members. Excuse me. So this was the first option that we were presenting to the board.
I want to address something that you had mentioned, the exercise in which we placed the dots, on the board, but across the board of all programs. And I do recall during the exercise that it wasn't, if we didn't vote for it, it was going to be cut, that maybe potentially we wouldn't put a dot there because we wanted more information about it.
And that's fine. I'm just saying that that's how we utilize that exercise.
So I want to make that clear, that it wasn't, it wasn't us actually voting on programs. It was potentially we didn't put a dot there because we wanted more information.
Another question, Pam. These reductions that are shown on this chart have already been deducted from plans E and F. That would be where we would go to look to meet those deductions that are required.
They are in penciled numbers in pink sections. This particular, for Plan E, it would hit 16 and 17. For Plan F, it would hit 16, and for Plan C, it would hit 15 and 16. So these figures are the equivalent of what's in the FY15 budget. They have not been removed.
Right.
These are options. All we're trying to do is provide, we wanted to meet the guidelines, and we wanted to provide options that would make the plan sustainable.
Great. Thank you.
The program matrix is the next section that we went to utilize to come up with these recommendations to meet the board's criteria. And it categorizes the programs in the general fund according to service and funding requirements. To start off, before I go a little bit more into detail of that, we've reviewed all the programs within the sections, and one of the things that we have actually found is that in the discretionary program with discretionary funding, there are programs that are actually listed within this section that have contractual obligations on them. Therefore, we cannot reduce them if they are multiple years, but if they are 1 year, then the next year they can be reduced. So there are things that will not show up when we provide you with the yellow list because of the contractual obligations that are related to them. Ms. Wilson and Mr. Methel will fix that next year. We will have a contractual section so that we won't have that issue and problem anymore, because we've added this section to last year's matrix, so this will be another addition that we'll make there for the contractual obligations, so that will be split out. So I did want to point that out to you if you were curious as to why something in the yellow section does not show up on the screen, that's the reason why. And the program matrix, everything that's in the green, and this is on our website under the FY15 budget, is mandated. That means that we are required to do it, and we are required to pay the amount of money that is sitting on the face value of that document. The blue zone, that is what we are required to do, but have discretionary funding level. We have to do it, but we don't necessarily have to spend as much money as we're spending on it. The discretionary programs with mandated funding due to contractual reasons is where we're going to move some of these things up to. That's in the pink zone, and there is some flexibility in those programs. The essential basic administrative services, that is more of your operational and your internal service departments, and I'll go into a little more detail about that. And then discretionary programs with discretionary fundings are programs in which the board has basically total control over whether they want to do them or they don't want to do them. In alphabetical order, no specific list, each one of them is done this way. I can go through each one of these starting at the top, and what I'm going to give you is the information related to these programs. We went through, we assessed, we have had discussions with some of the department heads regarding those, but just to get an understanding of what this actually means. Active Living and Parks Department, that is our Parks and Recreation and our senior centers. Those reductions would close down the Mount Pleasant Senior Center. It would close down Wallace Park, Camp Spencer, and Northwest Cabarrus Park. It would leave Frank Lisk open, and it would leave the Concord Senior Center open. The Animal Control Division would be the reduction of a position. The Arena and the Event Center contribution, that is the minimum amount we need to maintain that facility because we still owe debt service on it and we have a contractual obligation to take care of that asset. It also left money in there so that the graduations could continue and the fair could continue. But outside of that, that would reduce anything else that was related to that. The Arts Council contribution, that's the annual contribution we make to those. Cooperative Extension, that is the entire department. Economic Development Corporation, that is the entire contribution. Elma C. Lomax Educational Farm, that is the entire operations. Human Services, Nutrition, and Senior Services Division, that is both of those divisions that are not mandated. The Library Department, that would be delaying or postponing the Midland Library because in this circumstance it made no sense to open a library before you assessed what you needed to do with other ones. It would also close down the Harrisburg and Mount Pleasant Library. Planning and Zoning Division would be the reduction of a position. Special Olympics contribution would be a reduction of a position with the school system, and the Veteran Services Department would be a reduction of a position. The summation of all the yellow generate $2.8 million, which is another set of options to make these reductions with.
Pam, if we had a budget surplus of several $1 million like we have for the last 4.5 years, we wouldn't have to make any of those reductions, would we?
Yes, we would. Surpluses at the end of a fiscal year are one-time revenues. They do not reoccur. As Ms. Wilson's explained through the budget process, the very first thing we do is evaluate why we had money left over, and we make adjustments and modifications to the budget to encompass those things, and she can explain to you how she's addressed them.
If we went through and found the areas where we regularly over-budgeted a continuing expense, and that provided the surplus, then that would be an area that we could take that money, and that would offset any of these cuts, wouldn't it?
No, the consistent over-budgeting.
Really, that wouldn't offset the cuts. If we could find over-budgeting in a regular expense on a regular occasion, that wouldn't offset these cuts.
We address those each year during the budget process, and we modify and adjust them as necessary for the future budget. We take what we see in the historical and we make the adjustment into the future to see what we need to do The one area which I will say consistently we have money left over is salary and benefits, and that is due to the high turnover we have in human services and the sheriff's department.
Well, I would say this year, I specifically remember Ann giving us a multi-page report that showed us to have approximately, I think it was a $25 million surplus, and then we exempted those things out, those one-time things, and the reappropriation of items, and ended up with about a $14 million surplus. If I remember right, it was a 7-page document in September.
The estimated surplus for fiscal 14 is around $5.5 million. And as I said earlier, when we were looking at the budget and the process, we're like, well, what's causing this $5.5 million? We want to get closer than that. And so I looked at it, and the revenue side of it related to sales taxes and property taxes. And as you know, those go up and down, the sales taxes, with the economy and with the refunds. The property taxes, that's really our tax assessor. He's the one gives me the numbers that says this is what I think the valuation is on the revenue side. On the expense side, I took a look at it, and when I was doing plans, the cuts that I noted in the plans that we did, I cut expenses already over $1.4 million. So yes, what I guess we're saying is we've already taken those to come up with these net numbers.
We had a surplus at the end of 2011 of $14 million. We added another $13 million to that in 2012, and in 2013 we had $14 million exclusive of those one-time funds and reappropriation of items. And this year we're going to have another multi-million-dollar surplus. So if we do have a surplus, we do not have to make these cuts, as you've so eloquently laid out, because if you're budgeting here consistently, but your expenditures are usually here, you can bring your budget down to here without cutting a single service item, which is something we've talked about before.
And Ms. Wilson's trying to explain that she's
I'm
already done
telling you, I've
that.
already made extensive cuts to come up with these numbers.
Well, I would like to see that information, where you have reduced the budget from, whether it's line item, the items that you have consistently reduced to bring that expenditure down.
Okay. On the plan, you're going to see a total of about $1,974,000. Pam, can you point to that number? Okay, let me give you some examples of what cuts we've already taken in this process to get there. Transportation was cut $375,600. The ICE program was removed $256,952. Daycare was cut $170,000. Foster care was cut $109,000. Minor technology was cut $130,000. The contribution to the arena was cut $56,000. The power was cut $336,000. The salary adjustments were cut $435,000. Building and ground maintenance was cut around $330,000. So those were cuts that were taken before any of the cuts we've identified that need to be made. So the amounts in pink are over and above the cuts I've taken. And if you recall, I also pulled out an additional $450 and $750 in capital and other operating costs before I even started with the $207. So I think what Pam was saying when she was talking about how we've been through really, really extensive cuts back when the jail came on, and cut a lot of the, what I call below the line, anything but people, and naturally generally cut those before you cut people. So at that time it was so tight, they cut the below the line and still had to cut 76 positions. Well, now we've cut an additional several $million. And so I think what we were saying is, in terms of future cuts, you're talking programs and services.
I'll just respond by saying I don't think that there's a single member of this board that wants to cut a particular library, or shut down a library, shut down a park. I don't think any of us want to do that. Your 1 point, what number that is in the orange, I can't see from here, the things that you had just mentioned. This is my 4th year on the board, and every year there's been over $10 million worth of surplus. So that's where the problem lies. If we have that consistent surplus, and then, you know, the plan is to cut $2.8 million out of, you know, shutting down libraries or the parks, it just doesn't quite add up. So, you know, I want it to be clear. I want the media to be aware of this. I want the audience to be aware of this. I don't think any of us have given directive to shut down a park, shut down a library. That we don't want to do that. So it's trying to find that common ground, and I want to make sure that that is very clear.
We have had almost $50 million in surpluses in the last 4 years, so I am going to, I think this is a lot more about show than it is about anything else. We've had $50 million in surpluses, and I think that county does not want to make these cuts. They don't want to be held accountable, and so this is a big show in order to come out and make people that want some fiscal responsibility look bad. And that's okay. We can sit here through it. But with $50 million in surplus in 4 years, I'm having a very hard time believing that cuts like this are going to have to be made in order to get a balanced budget.
Well, I can tell you now, there's a lot of things up there I won't cut.
And I can promise you the staff does not recommend this either. And the only thing I can say to you is I've worked for this county for almost 26 years. I've been through every one of these budgets. We do the process. It's much better than what we used to do before. And what Ann and Parth have added this time around, they've got it down to salary and benefits down to the individual position. So we're actually going to be able to start evaluating it at that point. But I've showed you the historical trends where we have made reductions in expenditures. I've showed you how we've moved staff. We've rifted them in order to bring in other services. Every year where we have a surplus, yes, we evaluate it. We go back through the process and what caused it. And we make the adjustments so that hopefully it won't happen again. Cabarrus County has been very fortunate as we come out of this recession to have had the growth in property taxes, in building inspections, and in registered deeds. We have been extremely fortunate. And I can promise you that I caused part of those surpluses in 1 year because I budgeted low because I didn't believe we were going to come out as fast as we did. So one of those years, it would have been my responsibility for those revenues to have been too low. But we do this, we evaluate this. I've explained this process from day one that we go through, we look through the line items, we evaluate, and we make adjustments and changes to them as necessary. All we're trying to present here to you is we feel that we have exhausted the across-the-board cut. We have exhausted nitpicking here and there. If we want to make a change in the way we do things, we need to address the services that we provide Cabarrus County. We're just giving you options that you can look at. I'm not putting words in your mouth that you want to cut these things. This is what your options are, is all we're trying to express. We will do whatever the board directs us to do, and what they directed us to do and what Mr. Burridge directed us to do was to prove and show how these plans would work and whether it was viable and what it would do to the county. And this is our professional opinion, 26 years, 28 years, and 27 years. We've been working very hard at it.
I do continue to hear that these years added up, and I'm just pointing to the last 4 years we have had $50 million of surplus while you all have had that much experience. So I appreciate those numbers being laid out, but I just look at the recent history and see that we've had $50 million. I'm very appreciative of it, but I think, like I said, if you have $50 million in surplus for 4 years, this is more about a show than it is about actually coming up with a real budget, and that's okay. I'll sit here through it.
Next
I have
slide, please.
A question about, in discussion about the surpluses that we've realized over the past few years, and I have said this before and will repeat it, we certainly do not want to be in a situation at the end of the year where we say, well, we had hoped and prayed that sales taxes were going to come in higher, but they didn't. So I guess that means if we have to go into our fund balance to cover those expenses, which creates problems. I think we've been down that road before several years ago, and you may be able to tell me the years that we budgeted so close to our fund balance and had to increase the tax rate 10 cents in 1 year. We don't want to be in that position again. And so I think that this is a logical way to look at these expenses and very realistically and very prudently determine what our best guess is as to income and expenses. And so if we find ourselves in the fortunate situation of having a surplus, and you've explained the reasons why several times in regards to our property tax revenues, our sales tax revenues, I think we've gone through a pretty extensive explanation as to the refund process on sales taxes and how volatile and unpredictable that is. We certainly don't want to be caught short. The most important piece of that, in my opinion, is what have we done with those surpluses? We have used those surpluses that we just transferred over to capital improvements a few weeks ago to fund the construction of 2 new schools in the county. Had we not done that, had we not had those surpluses, we could have, I suppose, in each of those previous years, budgeted $20 million a year, or I just pull that figure out of the air, to go towards capital improvement projects, such as the new schools that we're having to build. Had we done that, then we would have had a deficit at the end of the year. Am I not correct? If we had budgeted capital reserves each of those years of $20 million, then we would have had no, and put that money away for future school projects or current school projects, then that would have eliminated any excess in any of those years.
Had we transferred it over?
Right.
Because we did accumulate it for a 4-year period, 2009 through 2013, I believe,
Right, and used it for, and set it aside for those purposes.
for the economic conditions that the county was going through, because once you transfer it over, you can't bring it back.
Right, so
for
rather
operational
than
expenditures.
providing a cushion during those questionable economic years, we gave ourselves greater flexibility to make sure we were covered in the event of a bad situation, or if revenues did not come in as high as expected.
That was our objective, yes.
Yes, and I think you were successful in that. And I don't think there's anything deceptive or about looking at those figures realistically going forward.
Any other questions? The next section of the matrix is the brown section, and that's the basic administration services. That's the basic support for county departments and the public. If any of these services in the other sections are to be reduced, these basic services may be reduced in proportion to the overall budget reductions. To give you an indication, general services, that department pays all the utility bills, pays all the maintenance contracts for all of our facilities, and does different projects. So if we were to close down a library, then general services department would change because it would no longer have those utility bills. So there's the relationship between this. If we were to close down a substantial number of departments, then maybe the support level in which these departments provide support could be reduced. So that's the next level in the brown section that are available for potential reductions, which is the Board of Commissioners Department, Communications Department, County Manager's Department, Finance Department, General Services Department, Human Resources Department, and IT Services Department. The blue section is the mandatory services and discretionary dollars. These services in this section cannot be completely reduced but can operate with less funding. Similarly, outside agencies may be reduced in proportion to the overall budget reductions as well. These are all of the departments and divisions within the blue section that are mandatory but have discretionary dollars. The Board of Elections Department is one of those. To point out to what you had mentioned earlier, Mr. Meesemer, we listed Cabarrus Health Alliance because if that was not a choice that the board wanted to make, then they would fall down into this section. So we did not make the decision to do that, but it was just the flexibility of, based on the outcome of the dot matrix exercise, we chose to list them again here if that was not the option that the board might want to do. the Cardinal Mental Health Contribution, the Construction Standards Division, Education, Cabarrus County Schools, Kannapolis City Schools, Rowan Cabarrus Community College, the Emergency Management Division, potentially the Fire District Staffing Grants. They have the ability to set their own tax rates at that level. Emergency Medical Services Department, Human Services has a vast number of departments: administration, adult and family services, CSE, child welfare, economic services, transportation, the Register of Deeds Department, the Sheriff, Patrol, Civil and Jail, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, Tax Assessor, Land Records and Appraisal, and Tax Collection Division. So another set of options that would be available to the board. The program matrix has of the potential. You have the timing of the reductions. Plan E would be in 16 and 17, requiring, if you were to go the exact way we presented it, the retreat direction would get 1.9 million, the yellow would do 721, and the reductions would be met. If you did Plan F for 16, the retreat directions once again would get the same amount of money. The matrix would get 2.8 million. There would be the 300,000 we had listed here, and we need another $153,000 in reductions to meet the 5.2. And to your point, Mr. Ostright, we did not do that for your plan because that would be your decision to make. Next slide. Go ahead. Okay, as Mr. Downs has explained, we have met with all the departments. We have met with Cabarrus County Schools, Kannapolis City Schools, Rowan Cabarrus Community College, EDC, and the Health Alliance, which are basically our outside agencies along with all of our departments. And they have turned in their request for funding next year. Some of that funding is requested for ongoing operationals, and some of it is for capital outlay, which would normally work its way through the CIP process and would be assessed as part of the budget process. So the three plans that are presented before you do not have any of the following requests. So these are options to be placed into the budget, but we have not addressed these issues based on preparing these plans. The Cabarrus Health Alliance is requesting an additional $356,000 in funding. Rowan Cabarrus Community College is requesting $85,800 in reoccurring funding. Kannapolis City Schools, $227,909. And Cabarrus County Schools, $17.9 million. Those are reoccurring operational expenditures that would go into this section of the 5-year plan. Their capital requests, those numbers are inclusive of some of their bond requests, so that's why they're so high. But Cabarrus County Schools did turn in a list of $146,908,221 as their request for capital this year. Kannapolis City Schools had a smaller number, but that included the projects that were not funded in the bond referendum, and the same with Rowan Cabarrus Community College. So these are needs that we would have to address outside of what we have established thus far at this point in time. Next slide. The unfunded county capital projects, and Mr. Burge, this is where you were referring to. This is the maintenance type things that we might not be able to address because of the lack of capital reserve funding. The radio replacements in public safety, it's time for that cycle to start back again on their 911 radios or 800 megahertz. Handheld vehicle radios, thank you. General Services needs to replace the chiller in this facility that we're in right now, $165,000. It may be able to be delayed another year, but he had requested that it be moved to this year. The Arena and Event Center has requested a high man lift of $131,000. They could continue to rent when they need that piece of equipment. The Soil and Water Conservation has requested $125,000 to continue their farmland conservation easements. The Board of Elections has requested some new election equipment. We are still working through those numbers, trying to assess what is the right equipment to purchase at this point in time, because a lot of things are actually changing in that process. And the Midland Libraries had $38,150 worth of capital requests that are not included in these plans. Some other things that the county had listed, there was, in May, there will be a salary study presented to the board. There is a component of it called a compression part, that's $779,000, and that has not been included. The staffing request for a 3-month period for the Midland Library branch of $36,918. General Services had some various projects around $360,000, and I think Mr. Downs explained the ABC listing that he does, and these were more the C-type projects. So those were some of the projects that he placed on the list for a little bit of delay funding on there. And then construction standards, there would be a delay for a permit clerk. They've had extensive growth in their building inspections. They're back up to the level they were prior to the recession, and they did lose a clerk during those rifted positions. The table on the next slide denotes outside agencies' reoccurring requests beyond fiscal 15, which have not been funded for the opening of new facilities. We've also not included them on any of the plans into our future calculations. On the slide thereafter, it includes potential construction shortfalls as stated by the schools. We all three addressed the $1.3 million to open the new elementary school. But as we've taken into consideration to fund the Cosmetology Center, Kannapolis Middle School, Mount Pleasant Middle School, Royal Oaks, and the new Technology Center, there will be additional operational costs that will come into play. This number seems extremely excessive, but it's part of an ADM formula calculation, and it's set by the state of North Carolina, and there's nothing that we can do as far as that's concerned. But in order for Kannapolis to get $1 million to fund the operations of Kannapolis Middle School, we have to give Cabarrus $7.5 million based on a formula. It's the rules. So I did want to point that out because it is a little disturbing. It's just the formula is calculated in there. If we have done some thinking past this point, and if we change the opening of different schools, and Ms. Wilson has worked on this, where if they all opened in the same year, that number could be massaged so that Kannapolis gets what they need, Cabarrus gets what they need, but we don't have to excessively contribute more money because they weren't combined together. And I hope that makes sense, but it's a state formula, and I think we experienced that when we were doing the 1% salaries with Kannapolis City Schools earlier. Potential shortfall in construction. This is strictly the information that was given to us by the schools, and these are the projects that we funded that'll have the $43 million in the bond referendum and other cash contributions to make up that $55 million. The schools have requested some additional funding for different projects, and the shortfall is $16.2 million that should they go to the bidding process and need additional funding, that the county would be obligated, if a bond referendum passes for these projects, we would be most likely obligated to have to fund that because we put the bond referendum out there, and if there's not enough funding to cover it, based on the conversation with the local government commission, that the expectation is that we come up with the rest of the money. You can go ahead to. I'm going to sit down and turn this over to Parth.
I'm going to give a summary of everything that you've seen so far. It's not really going to be anything new, just trying to put everything together so that way you have I guess, a bigger picture of everything that went on in the last hour or so. So how are the three plans similar? And they all follow the BOC guidelines, as Pam mentioned a little bit earlier. They have the debt issuance amounts. They also have the same revenues, with the exception of the property taxes. So you'll see in a slide, I guess 2 slides from now, where the property taxes are different. There are employee salary adjustments. They also have the same beginning balance of expenditures in FY15, which was that 207 amount that Ms. Dubois mentioned earlier. There is funding of the new elementary school, operational cost, and 1% annualized raise for the school staff. Retirement of existing debt, economic incentive grant funding, the Cabarrus Health Alliance one-time reduction, and the Board of Commissioners contingency reduction. All of that essentially is on the face of the plan. If you walk around, you can see that. Where they differ, though, is the tax rates. And again, you'll see this in a slide coming up. They differ also in the required reduction. So you saw anywhere from $2.5 million to $12.5 million. Cash accrual, you saw the slide from earlier, the net cash accumulation differs as well, going all the way up to $30 million, and that's in Plan C. Excuse me. With that cash accrual, though, Plan C includes debt service, guideline requirements, and architects and engineering in that purple line that Ms. Dubois had shown a little bit earlier. So it just shows up in a slightly different spot, and we want to make sure we're very clear about that. Then maintenance money for schools, that also is slightly different because in Plans E and F, there's reoccurring maintenance money, and that shows up in FY17. And then county personnel additions. We've gone ahead and added some personnel in fiscal years 15 and 16, and that is where there's some difference as well. So when you look at everything that we've talked about, and Ms. Dubois has put this up on the easel, this is essentially the same thing that you see on the PowerPoint, that the required reductions range anywhere from $2.6 million in Plan E to $5.2 million in Plan F to $12.5 million in Plan C. The tax rate, you can see from Plan E in 2015 is 70 cents, and it drops down to 67.93 cents, and that's the revenue neutral amount. Plan F is the same thing, and Plan C does see that reduction beginning in fiscal year 15, dropping down to 63.4 cents in fiscal year 17. The debt issuance amount is the exact same, $43 million across all the guidelines, where we provide additional $2 million for RCCC, additional $2 million for Mount Pleasant Middle School, 1.5 for the cosmetology program, and then, of course, the fact that they are all revenue neutral in FY17. Those all check off, and again, that's per the guidelines.
Parth, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
According to Plan E and Plan F,
Yes.
the change resulting from revaluation is $6.7 million, but you only have a $4.1 million credit to make that revenue neutral. That's a $2.7 million difference. How is that revenue neutral?
Okay.
Revenue neutral has a growth factor with it. The way the state formula is established, you plug the numbers in, you come up with what the tax rate was for the last 3 years, put that in, come up with an average. We can actually send the form out to you. It comes up with an average, shows you what the growth is, because you're going to have natural growth even in a revaluation year, so your property tax revenue is going to go up. And then it comes down and tells you what the revenue neutral was at that point in time.
And that makes sense, except for the fact that we separately account for the growth, and so we're double counting that, and so that's not technically a
We're not
revenue
double
neutral.
counting it.
We have a growth in tax base right underneath it, which is 2.638.
But that growth in tax base is affected by that revaluation also.
It's the same growth from 2015, 16, and 17. We're counting growth for 2017, and then we're counting growth again in terms of calculating the revaluation.
When you calculate revenue neutral, there is no growth that's calculated into the factor of the number that's the minus that's on that piece of paper. That is the revenue neutral calculation without growth in it. Then you have the natural growth that comes onto it. It's the state formula that's provided that we're required to utilize. When we prepared your plan, you did not like the differential in those numbers, so we took you down one more penny.
The tax revenue for increase for 2017 is 2.6 plus 6.7, which will get you to 9.3 million. And then we have a $4.18 million credit. So that's a difference of $5 million. And we're counting growth in that also, which is 2.6 million. So that's double counting the growth.
It's not double counting. It's a state formula that's been provided to us. We take revenue, we take the tax rate from the previous year. We calculate what revenue neutral is without the growth. That comes up with that negative number. So you have revenue neutral, you have the tax growth, and then you minus out the revenue neutral because you wanted the rate to go down. Those two numbers never match. It's the reality of how the process and whoever decided to establish that formula. Then you have the growth from last year to that year. It is not double counting it.
Well, we'll have to talk about that some because in Plan C, we had done a true revenue neutral rate, which was to remove all of the increase in tax bill that people are going to pay, because under this, people are still going to pay an increase in their tax bill.
We did revenue neutral minus 1 penny because that's what you wanted.
So, as mentioned before, the net accumulated cash is $14.6 million in Plan E, $20.2 million in Plan F, and $30 million in Plan C. So the outstanding debt as of June 30th, 2021 would be the exact same across all three plans, which is at $163.3 million. That concludes our presentation. If there are any questions, of course, Ann, Pam, Ms. Dubois, Ms. Wilson, Mr. Downs, and Mr. Marshall, and myself are here.
We've thrown a lot of numbers at you today. We're available for questions now, or we can add this to our regular meeting on Monday for further discussion. That way you guys will have a little bit more time to digest the numbers.
Well, we don't need to add it, it's already on there.
It's already,
Because you already put it on there when we approved that, so.
That's correct. Yeah. What we would like, if not on the 21st, as soon thereafter, is some direction from the board so that we can continue to move through the process. Is what do you feel the proposed tax rate should be for FY15, so that we can go ahead and continue through the budget process and make the appropriate changes and calculations depending on what the board votes on. So it doesn't have to be the 21st, but as soon thereafter, maybe by the work session, simply because we've got to continue on with the process, and your budget meetings start in late May. So we're getting pretty close to that time.
Well, I would just say that every time we start to look at any sort of fiscal responsibility, Chicken Little comes out and people start yelling, the sky is falling. In 2012, June of 2012, when the commission was planning to raise the tax rate, we were told that we were going to close the libraries, lay off our emergency paramedics and get entry-level EMTs. We were going to close the parks. We were going to close the senior centers if we didn't raise the tax rate. And in September 2013, I sat in this exact chair, and Ann sat in that chair and acknowledged that we had a $14 million surplus and that we could have kept the tax rate exactly the same and still provided services to exactly the level that we had provided them and had a $1 million surplus. I am looking at we keep hearing that services would be decimated if we went to a budget of $205 million. And I am looking at the 2013 5-year plan, which is the 5-year plan that was proposed so that you could raise the tax rate. And the 2015 budget total expenditures for that year was $199 million. And so this idea that a $205 million budget is wholly insufficient and would lead to people dying and all the parks being closed, I find that to be a little bit realistic, considering it's still $6 million more than what you had told the people you planned to budget in 2015. Now, I can't imagine this board would pass a budget that was unrealistic in terms of what our expenditures would be in 2015, because that would be very problematic to the public. But I do think that 2013 was a very good reflection of what the budget looks like when our staff has an incentive to actually come up with a budget that conservatively spends money, because they were trying to get the tax increase passed, and you certainly didn't want to have a lot of expenditure increases in subsequent years. And so you worked very hard to make a realistic budget of expenditures. And like I said, $199,179,000. And so I think all of Plan E, F, and C spend more money next year than that. So I think this is a little bit Chicken Little, to be honest.
I had a question to ask about the revenue neutral tax rate computation. I'm assuming that is the same worksheet that would have been used when the tax rate was adjusted at the last reval, which I think was revenue neutral minus 2 cents. Is that correct?
Revenue neutral, and the tax rate would have been 72 cents, and the board opted to come down 2 cents.
And so the growth was accounted for the same way at
Same
that
formula.
time that it is in the plan that we're looking at here.
Same formula from day one, yes.
Right, and of course, that rate increase, which was 2 cents less than revenue neutral, has been frequently referred to as a tax increase, which is incorrect. And I've said before, I think my personal property tax bill decreased by $50 when that rate adjustment was made. So to me, it was a tax decrease. And I felt the impact of that 2 cents less than revenue neutral. Another piece of, you gave us the cuts that you had on the screen, which I would like to have a list of those specific items that you mentioned as far as which libraries would be affected and so forth, and I'm sure you have that available. That, and I'm doing this strictly from memory, was 2.8 million, is that correct?
Yes. Back up to that slide. There it is,
Right,
2833.
2.8, and then the slide that we were looking at just then, those would be the reductions that would satisfy Plan E only. Is that correct? And I have.
They satisfy Plan E and F. There's just an additional, a little bit more money that F needs. That's the
F,
additional.
with that, okay, and you've got that included up there. So in Plan E, Plan F, we would have to cut that full 2.8 million plus an additional 300,000 from the blue items on the matrix to balance that budget. Am I reading it correctly?
You still have the ability to go into the brown section.
So we could
Like I
take.
explained, that if some of these facilities were closed, that general services have things budgeted in them that would no longer be
They may
necessary.
automatically decrease a little bit as
Somewhere
well.
around $150,000 to $250,000 if all of those were reduced.
Right, and so we haven't even looked at what kind of reductions would be required for Plan C, which is 12.5 million. And the program matrix, when I took the yellow portion of our matrix, which are the discretionary services and discretionary dollars, the things that we have total flexibility over, and when we remove those items that you had mentioned earlier, some of those had already been cut and some of them need to be reclassified, like retiree benefits, the total amount, if we cut everything on that list, would be $7,098,000. So that means we would still have $5 additional million to cut that would have to come out of the brown items and the blue items, which I know that's somebody that's not looking at the page, that's difficult to understand, but that would be the blue items would be mandated services and discretionary dollars. The brown items would be basic administrative services. So that additional $5 million would have to come out of those categories. Is that correct?
The additional money, yes, you'd need to work your way back up the matrix.
And so Plan C is the only one that provides for a decrease in the tax rate.
Except for in the revaluation year.
And that should be revenue neutral.
That was what the guideline requested.
So in order to cut the tax rate, we're going to have to make some pretty severe cuts in services somewhere in those categories. So I don't see how we can honestly say that we're trying to say the sky is falling when these are real numbers and historical figures that we're looking at, and real services, it troubles me that we would have on the table, for example, the Midland Library. They have come to us, they've discussed that project with us, they have included it in their building plans that they're currently undertaking. We have made a commitment to them to support that library as we have in Mount Pleasant and Harrisburg in years past. And so now we're in a position of saying, well, we're going to have to take that back. We're not going to do what we said we were going to do. If we were in an emergency situation, certainly we might have to do that. There are other commitments that we have made to the citizens as well that we may have to renege on. I guess the thing that I'm most curious about are the school needs that we've spent so much time talking about. If I understand correctly from the presentation we've seen, there's $16.5 million in requests for school facilities that we have not included in our, we've not appropriated any funds for those at all, and have said on numerous occasions, if you bid these schools out, and now that I'm not even counting those expansion requests, I'm just
One more
talking about
slide.
the facility
There.
request, that one. And I think when we had the discussion with the school board about specifically Royal Oaks Elementary and Mount Pleasant Middle School, well, we also did the Northwest area school. They asked for 19.5 million. We appropriated 17.5 and said to them, you put this out to bid, and then if you find that your estimates are accurate and you're going to need more, then come back and talk to us. Same thing with Mount Pleasant Middle School. Those two projects alone are $8.5 million potential shortfall that if they come back with those estimates, then we've got to figure out where to come up with that money. And I don't see any flexibility in these budgets for us to be able to do that without, we would have to start from scratch in order to come up with those funds.
I don't think that's true.
The other thing that we've talked a great deal about are the maintenance needs of the schools. And I know that these somewhere in the process, there are some additional funds that are generated that could potentially be used for maintenance expenses. I think at our last work session, the school system said the roofing project at Northwest Cabarrus Middle School would be $1.3 million, which would be a project over and above the ordinary maintenance funds that we provide to them. So if I haven't seen any provision in these three plans to fund a project like that or other, and that's just one example. I know that they have some other projects. Do we have any flexibility in here to come up with that kind of money to replace these roofs and hopefully, as Commissioner Burridge has pointed out a number of times, deferred maintenance ends up costing us more money in the long run than taking care of things as they're needed. So is that provided anywhere in these plans?
All three of the plans have some net accumulated cash, and depending on what time frame that cash is available, there are options there to do that, to do the roofs, to do some of that excess funding that's being requested on there.
Plan C has $10 million next year to do roofs.
And I think Plan C is the one that requires us to cut $12 million out of the budget in order to come up with $10 million to do roofs.
It requires us to cut $7 million to come up with the money to do roofs. If we would like to do the tax reduction, that's how we get to the $12 million. But only $7 million to fund all of the schools that we need to with cash. by the way, there was $0 allocated to build new schools or any of that maintenance in the budget for this year or for the next 5 years. So we do not have another plan that is going to provide any of those things, and I've been waiting for you to tell me what you would like to do in order to provide those things, and you have been unable to. So we are in May now, or April, and you've never provided a plan other than go borrow $100 million, and that's clearly not going to work. We have borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars over the last period of time, and our debt service payment has grown to be so much that now we can no longer afford to provide the services at the level. And that's one of the reasons that we, Commissioner Burridge, myself, and Commissioner Meismer, have had to work to rectify the problems that were created from the failing policies of continually borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars for projects that we probably didn't need.
Well, you know, I think that that there is some inaccuracy in some of the things that you say. First of all, you indicate that you have repeatedly asked what the plan is. What you have a plan, what is your plan? We have been through plan A, B, C, D, E, and F. So I think that it is not my job as a single commissioner to come up with a plan for the 184,000 people of Cabarrus County. It is our job as a body of 5 commissioners to work together along with the school board to come up with a plan to handle the needs of all the citizens of the county as well as the schools. I would never come forward with my plan without the cooperation and working together with the other commissioners. So that is the answer to that question.
So you have no plan? Is that what you're saying? You have no plan?
No, I'm saying that we've got A, B, C, D, E, F. We've got 6 plans to look at. Now, I guess that probably I could take the position that you do, and I could say, folks, I'm going to come up with the Steve Morris plan, because I am smarter than any of the professionals that we have on our staff. I have more experience and expertise in the area of school construction, architecture, engineering. I can come up with better figures than our school board can come forward with. I can also look at the reports from the Department of Public Instruction in Raleigh, where they have rated their schools as the schools. I looked at one John Locke Foundation newsletter, the most conservative group, I think, probably in the state, had an article about school construction. Included in that article, they had a chart of the 5 most expensive schools built in the state of North Carolina and the 5 least expensive schools built in the state of North Carolina. On those least expensive schools in the state, 3 of those were Cabarrus County schools, Cabarrus County projects. You know, we can go back and we can look at the details. You have mentioned McClintock Middle School in Charlotte several times. You know, we can compare the differences between the schools that we have provided for our citizens. McClintock has, it has a gym, but it does not have an auxiliary gym. It has a gym that is much smaller than our Winkler Middle School, which you refer to a great deal. I think that their gym seats about 450 people, whereas Winkler seats about 1,200 students for the entire student body. The classroom sizes are below by 100 square feet Department of Public Instruction's recommendation for middle schools. Winkler has 3 classrooms for exceptional children. McClintock has none. And we can go down the list and compare item to item. I do not think that we have unwisely spent money on school facilities in Cabarrus County. I think the Department of Public Instruction in Raleigh agrees with us. I think that we can compare with other school systems, and they will agree with us. So this is not just me coming up with my opinions and my ideas. These are opinions and ideas that come from people who are supposed to be the top professionals in what they do. I think that that is also true with our county staff. I think they have done an exceptionally good job of guiding us through the recessionary period that we have experienced. I think we have budgeted wisely. That is the reason that we have not had shortfalls during those years. We've managed to continue to provide services to our citizens that I think are satisfactory. And when we look at these lists of potential cuts, I can sit here all day long and say that I don't agree with them. I don't think that's right. I think you just made those things up. And I've heard you say those exact words to our school board members. Sitting in that chair, you said, I think the school board just sits around and makes up numbers and brings them to us because they think that we'll pay for them. I don't think that's the caliber of elected official that we have in Cabarrus County. I don't think that's why they run for office. I don't think that's why they come here and try to work out solutions for the problems that we have. I think for us to say to the voters in Cabarrus County, we have been wasting money. We have built Taj Mahal schools. We have done all these unwise things just because we thought it was the thing to do, with no substantiation whatsoever. I do not think that's true. I think that this board, and I think that those who have served before us have had a similar motivation to try to do the best we can with the resources that we have available to us. And for us to try to gloss over that and say that the presentations that we received or the facts and figures that are on the page are inaccurate, I think is very unfair to everybody involved. So I think we need to sit down as a group of 5 commissioners and come up with a plan together to address these needs. If the figures that we've seen today, I have spent hours going over these proposed plans since last, I guess it's been about 2 weeks now that we've received them. And I've tried to come up with my answers apart from the answers that staff has given us. I think theirs are probably a little bit less drastic than what I might have come up with, and I've worked with the information that's provided to us with our funding matrix and the programs that are outlined there. When we say that we've got to close down a senior center, and I think our nutrition sites were included on that list as well. We've had extensive discussion at these meetings before about the importance of our Lunch Plus program, where our seniors get nutritious meals and have an opportunity to interact with other people. We've talked about the long-term savings that we might potentially realize that by keeping people healthier and keeping them in their homes. And so, there are different ways to categorize the money that we spend. Some of it is expense and some of it is investment. And I think the big chunk of it, and certainly those nutrition sites would be one of those, as well as our senior center. That is an investment in our future in this county. I think that our libraries and our library services are also an investment. We're enabling people to take care of themselves, to find seniors to remain healthy and care for themselves, students and others to be able to use the resources, the library to find jobs and get an education. So, investments are important, and I think that they will have a payback. And we could probably go back and forth for 4 or 5 hours on a lot of these topics.
We started collecting $30 million more a year in tax revenue in 2009 over 2008, and we've collected that every year since. And yet our budget for this year had $0 allocated to build new schools. For the next 5 years, it had $0 allocated to build new schools. That is a plan to fail. That is the reason that I went to work trying to come up with a plan. In addition to that $30 million being collected every year since 2008, our teacher supplement has gone up by a total of $110. That is unacceptable. That is one of the reasons we came up with a new plan. Now, we are no longer going to accept failing plans. If the only option was a failing plan, then I needed to come up with a new plan. And that's what we got together, and I've been working on and brought the board those presentations because we had a plan to fail, and that was unacceptable to me.
So my question would be, how, in your plan, which I guess would be Plan C, how much is budgeted for school construction in the next 5 years?
$88 million.
$88 million, and that would be, is that the same money that we're going to use for roof replacements and maintenance, or is that over and above that?
No, the roof replacement and maintenance is over and above that. And through 2020, there's $22 million in that fund, in addition to that $88 million to fund those things.
So on Plan C, can you tell me which line to look on to find, would that be your estimated unassigned fund balance?
No, that's an additional surplus that we can use to increase the services of our county in future years. Plan C takes all of the cash and puts it into a separate plan, and it is on this sheet. We have $31 million available next year, and then, this year, $10 million available. In addition to all the 6 projects that we've talked about, we will have $22 million through 2020 in order to fund maintenance and smaller priority cost items. And that is, so let me explain the difference between the plans. There are 6 plans. 5 of those plans have all of the money basically as operational expenses. My plan, Plan C, it's not my plan, it's just Plan C. I don't want to assign anybody else to the plan that hasn't voted for it, so I'm just trying to be cautious of that. That plan takes this giant pool of cash and moves it over to a cash fund that is specifically for our schools. And then when you see those surpluses start to build in Plan C, those funds are available for a lotto, for anything. I mean, they can be used to increase our employee pay. They can be used to increase our EMS services. We could give them to the schools to lower classroom sizes. We could give them to the schools to hire more teacher assistants. We could give them to the schools to increase teacher pay. We could build more parks with that money. That money is not required in order to fund the school maintenance obligations that are contained in the cash plan. The cash plan is separate. It has $208 million that's separate and apart from all county revenue to go and build the schools. We're sending them on the way. That's the difference between the plan that I have and all the other plans. All the other plans require at least A, B, and D require heavy borrowing in order to fund the schools. And that borrowing is going to spike our debt service payment. And when you go from 42 million, when you want to talk about mandatory, debt service is a mandatory obligation. When we go borrow that money, we are obligated to pay that back. So if you're looking a sheriff deputy in the eye and he asks you for a raise, if you've increased our debt service payment by $9 million, you're going to have to look him in the eye and say, no raise for you. And the reason why is because that $9 million has to go to our debt first. And so one of the things that we need to do as a county is to reduce that debt service payment to give us the flexibility to address the needs of the county as they come up. We are in an incredibly dynamic economic situation right now. Hopefully we're coming out of that, but anybody that knows anything about the economy knows that it's all based on this Fed stimulus, quantitative easing, and whoever knows how long that will go on. And so as long as we continue to grow our debt service, we are basically putting ourselves in handcuffs to such a degree that we are not going to be able to deal with issues as they arise, because our number one priority is going to be to pay that debt. And that's not my number one priority. My number one priority is to pay for the teachers, to get better sheriffs. We need to transition away from prioritizing buildings which require debt into building sufficient buildings that don't require debt, so that we have the flexibility to come back and address what I think our number one priorities is, which is dealing with the employees and the services and the people of our county.
I think in a little clarification, in looking at Plan C, capital reserve additions for schools in 2015, on the sheet that I'm looking at, is $7 million. And 2015 that amount is $8 million.
Right.
2017 is $9.5 million. And you talked about a large accumulation of funds. As I read this, it would take, if you took the capital reserve additions in 2015 and 2016, you still would not have enough to cover the 16.2 million shortfall on the chart that we're looking at on the screen.
You are
If
reading
you
it
look-
incorrectly. You're reading it incorrectly. And
Okay, well, tell me how to read it.
if you look up where reduction of debt service is, and you see that it's only $1 million, when you start looking through, that takes that money and puts it into the cash fund. And so this is a separate fund by which we are going to fund those things. And so we accumulate the retirement of debt service into this fund, which is in addition to the monies that you were talking about, and also in addition to the $30 million of cash that we already put into it.
Well, I guess I would address this question to Ms. Wilson. How can there be money that can be put in another fund that is not reflected on this 5-year plan?
It's just a retirement of the debt. We no longer have to pay it, so it goes into the cash plan. If
Well, I
we are
think
paying $42 million
retirement-
right now, it goes over there.
I think retirement of the debt is already included in these figures, if I'm not mistaken. And we've talked so much about the amount of our debt, and you use the figure of $100 million. If we took our debt level at the beginning of, and I don't have the papers in front of me, probably 2013, and if we added $100 million to that, which I've heard the figure thrown around, we would be at $750 million. In actuality, if we added $100 million to our debt, if we were doing that when this bond referendum, if it were to be approved, and of course it's been drastically reduced, our overall level of debt would be less then than it was at the beginning of this year, I think.
That's not correct, because our total debt is inclusive of interest owed. And so when you add $100 million to it, really you would add about $150 million to it. So we reduce our payment by $42 million this year, but then you would add $150 million to it. So if you take 469 and minus 42, you end up at about 427, and then add $150 million to that, you end up at 575.
Right, and of course, we're not talking about putting that debt online this year, but I want to hear
Yeah.
Mr. Bois' answer to the question about this excess money going into another fund.
Okay. What Mr. Osterreich has asked for is that in the very first year, he generated a $7 million cash fund. And as he stated to you, as debt service is retired, it is being added to the $7 million that was generated. So that $7 million reoccurs every single year. So the $7 million plus the $1,061,000 of retired debt and so on goes down here. Also inclusive in his plan are some excess funds that are down here. Okay? Without the cash spreadsheet, it is very difficult to see. But he also has $5.5 million that we estimate the year end to be excess fund balance. That's inclusive in his cash numbers. You can't see it. And a little over $1.1 million in the reduction of the 15% fund balance level, because the budget goes down to $205 million versus the current level that it's at. So those numbers are being placed on this rolling schedule that he has, which it's a little difficult to see it here, but this is the cash he's generated off of this plan.
Right.
It's fed into his cash plan. Then he's got where the debt service comes in, where the debt is being borrowed, and then the money's being expended. So he's showing where his money's coming in and his money is going out. And then his debt service, where on the county's plan is on the face of the document, his debt service also comes out of these cash numbers.
Right.
So he has the cash flow that has been generated. He'll have the first year you said you had roughly $10 million. In 15, in 16 you'll have about $708,000, because your debt service will start kicking in And then in 2017, it picks back up to 2.6 million. In 18, it goes to 6.8, and then 19, it goes to about 11.6. And roughly, there's about 2 million that'll come out of there for the architects and engineering. But so that number does grow, like he has indicated to you, but it starts with the basis of developing the $7 million number.
Right.
Now, what we can't show you when he refers to going out to 208 million out into the future with plans that are here. And the reason why we cut this thing off on 2019 was we just didn't have enough time to start projecting the future out for all three plans to be equal. This debt service will fall off of both of these plans too. Because of the way this debt service is listed on this plan, it's reoccurring money, so it will be dropping down to being in excess so that Plan E and F will start generating more cash also, where the cash he's generating, his debt service is already coming out of it, so he will continually thrive off of the $7 million plus the additional reduction in debt service and then anything in excess. So the cash is being generated. It's kind of fluctuating the first couple of years because of the addition of the two debt services, but it will start escalating as the future goes on, just like the other plans, but it will escalate faster because of this.
Right, and all of that, for any of that to work, we have to do those two cuts in pink, which total 12.5 million.
Yes.
Well, that's not quite true, because to do the cash for schools plan, we only need to cut 7. Now, that's also including a second tax rate reduction. So technically, you could do the cash for schools plan with a $7 million reduction if you didn't do the tax reduction. But the $12 million is for a tax reduction going back to 63 cents and also the cash for schools plan. There are two components of that.
Right. He does have the tax rate reduction showing here. And like he indicated to you, the $7 million is generated from one phase, and the reduction in the tax rate is the addition. So if you kept both the reduction in the tax rate and generated the $7 million, you need the 12. If you drop off these two, you'll come down about $5-6 million.
So that would be only if we left the tax rate where it currently exists.
Here, yeah, for these 2 years, and then you would still have the impact of what, if you do revenue neutral minus 1 cent.
Right, and that would put us back down to 67 cents, probably a little bit lower than your rates. Your rates are 67.9, I guess.
67.93 versus yours is 63.40.
Yeah.
It'd have to be recalculated to see what the impact of that was, but it would probably, I would say that it would be 66.93 would be my guess, because it'd be a penny lower.
Right.
In order
So
to meet that penny that you
be-
wanted.
That would be Plan G, because it would be different from
Okay.
these others. And so it calls for a 7.
Just whatever
you know,
the next
so
letter
we've now
is.
gone A through G, and that would require a $7 million budget cut. And so we just saw what $2.8 million budget cut looks like. So I think we can all easily speculate if we were to a little over double that, then we would have to look at some additional closures of facilities, I guess, is the only place we could go, because
Well,
if we eliminate that staff, and I get calls, I get complaints from builders already.
But if you were only looking at the 7 million, you would be close to what F is. You'd be
Which
a
is
little over 2 million off. You'd be
5.2.
right at $2 million off. So that's what the difference would be.
And-
If you eliminated the tax decreases, this number would be somewhere around $7 million.
But we haven't identified what those $5.2 million in cuts would be either, right?
We identified.
2.8
Can we
of
go
it?
backwards, Parth? Yeah. So we're there, there'd be just some more reductions in that area. But yes, it would definitely change this dramatically to remove those tax drops.
Right,
Tax rate
so
changes.
to satisfy the cuts on Plan F, we would do the things that we looked at on the yellow matrix, which included closing various things, all of those things.
Like I said, some of this is partial. Some of it's partial, some of it's, that's keeping it open because it's an asset. That's closure. No funding, closure, close 2 branches, reduction in staff, no longer contributing, reduction in staff.
So on the library department, for example, that would close the Mount Pleasant and Harrisburg libraries completely?
That is what that number represents. But like I said, the utilities part's over in GSA, so.
So we'd get a little extra over there as well. Although, well, the municipalities own those facilities, right?
The municipality owns the town of Harrisburg, so it would be a walk away. We own Mount Pleasant.
Uh-huh.
I don't know, that's why those numbers of reductions from 130 to 230 are varied depending on what we do with the building when we're finished.
Right, whether we have to continue to maintain it or whether we try to sell it or...
And that's why the Arena and Event Center, there has to be money left there because it is a collateralized asset. It's just like your home, there's a loan on it, and we got to take care of it.
So that $300,000 on the arena, it's just to keep the building alive. I mean, we
And do the
would not be
maintenance,
programming...
But it's also for graduation and the fair.
Uh-huh.
But yes, the basic utilities, because you can't close it all, because if it gets too hot, then you get mold, and if it gets too cold, you get cracked pipes, and I left that up to General Services to help calculate what the effects of that would be, because that's beyond my
And active
scope.
living in parks, that closed Camp Spencer,
Northwest
Cabarrus,
and Mount Pleasant Senior Center.
Mount Pleasant Senior Center, and Wallace.
Everything but Frank List Park, right?
Franklin's
And the
Park
senior
and the
center.
Concord Senior Center.
Senior Center.
Right, and that's to get us to, well, and you said, and then the other things were where you came up with the total reductions on Plan F. I get my letters mixed up. So that nutrition, senior services, is that the entire Lunch Plus program?
Yes.
And so the Lomax Educational Farm, would we have any additional obligations maintaining that property?
We're not sure what our we're not sure. That's why when the mowing and stuff like that are in General Services budget, so we may not be able to get rid of that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why those other things were blank, because until a decision was made, we didn't know what the actual effects would be. We have an estimate between a range, but not exact figures, because do we have to still mow the grass?
Right.
Do we not renew the lease for the property because, it's a non-appropriation of funds? Can we get out of the contract and not have to pay that lease anymore? Do we have to do anything there to secure the site? I mean, that's
Right.
just, in the period of time that we had to come up with with the options, we did not have enough time to go into that. That's why we indicated that there would be stuff in GSA that would be affected based on whatever decision was made. And the staff was trying to give you a concept of what it would take to meet these obligations. We don't recommend the obligations. They are suggestions. Nobody put, I didn't mean to say the essentials versus non-essential was, we took that exercise as a vote, and then there was another section of that was the monetary side of it. We just took that as some guidelines and directions to come up with a concept to present.
And so what would that mean to the cooperative extension service? I know there's some cooperation between the state and the county. Would that department continue to operate? Or?
We fund 50% of the salaries and all the operational costs, and that is our share of the 50% of the salaries and
all of the
operationals.
operational costs? So without those funds, they would not be able to continue to operate?
Correct. And then the unique situation in that is that Soil and Water is in that building, and the Forester's in that building, so you can't completely close the building down. So that makes that another unique situation.
Soil and Water you have to keep.
We have to keep the elected board.
Is there any grant money in any of these funds? This is
They're
all
all
county
net.
fund?
They're all netted out.
Okay,
This is true county expenditure.
county expenditure.
Because like in the nutrition program, there is some limited grant funding that we do receive in that, but that has been netted out.
So we would
Active
be
Living in Park has program
refusing those
fees.
grants, sending those grants back.
There is potential, excuse me, there is potential under the, I'm gonna see if this is right, HCCBG grant funding, that if we didn't take it for some of these areas, that we might be able to divert it to another area. Like if we didn't take it for community development, don't you have some money from there? If she didn't take it for the community development and you divert it and go give it to whoever's else on the list, and I'm sorry, but I'm not familiar with who's on that list. There's just a trickle-down effect.
Well, personally, I think we're sitting here talking about something we know is not going to happen because all these cuts can't take place. I want to thank the staff for doing what we asked you to do, bring back to us what y'all thought plan would work. Now, whatever plan is chosen, that'll be up to the commissioners when we get to May, and then we'll work from there, is all I can say. But I do know that these cuts, most of these cuts will not be made, I can promise you. Or I won't vote for them, I can tell you that now.
Ms. Poole stepped out for a second. Does anybody else have any questions or comments, or?
Well, the only comment I have is, we've looked at this screen and it's been on this screen for a little while, and I want to make it clear to everyone that I don't think that any one of the commissioners are proposing to completely cut any libraries, to cut any parks, to close any parks, close any libraries. I don't think that that's any one of our proposals at all. So I want to make that very clear. And, referring back to a comment that you had made, Commissioner Morris, about, whenever the tax rate went revenue neutral 2 years ago, your property tax on your home may have went down by $50. However, the value of your car didn't go down. However, the rate went up. So you were paying additional taxes on your vehicle taxes at that time. So that was a tax increase for you. And I did hear this 2 years ago whenever we went through the budget process that, we were going to have to shut parks, shut libraries, if we did not increase the tax rate. And I just absolutely did not believe that was true. And the very next year we did have the $14 million surplus, so that would not have happened. And I've heard these arguments time and time again. Every time during budget process, everybody gets nervous, every department gets nervous, staff gets nervous, school system gets nervous, but we're still going through this process, and any of these proposals is not set in stone. So I just want to make that abundantly clear that we are still working through this process. We still have scheduled budget meetings in May, so that's where a lot of details will be worked out.
You're on.
Thanks. Sorry. I heard part of what you said. I apologize. Larry, do you want to?
I'm making a motion to adjourn.
I just have one question, and you may have just answered it, and I apologize if you did. I'm sorry. The only question that I have is what I've heard so far. E and F were as a result of the motion that was passed, and that's why staff tried to follow that. I know you said earlier you weren't happy with what was on the list, so I agree with that list and the other list. So I guess the only question I have is back at the beginning where we've been for a very long time. For $7 million for the schools, it's either $2 million more than F or it's $7 million from somewhere if the tax rate's not changed. If the tax rate's changed, it's sorry, I'm having trouble reading it because it's small, 9.1. What I heard over and over again from everybody that's called me and left messages at home, thank you very much for leaving messages. I just want to know where that is. So if it's not this, then where is it? And I just think that's what needs to come out. Personal choice for my husband and myself is to eliminate debt. personal choice that I hope that I have instilled in my 2 children is to eliminate debt, only put on a credit card what you can pay off when the bill comes at the end of the month. If you're buying a house, we're not rich unless we win a lottery. I can't pay cash for big purchases like that. So, you know, I think that's how most people should be. I think that we do have way too much debt on a personal level, and you know, we have to find a way to meet the needs, whether it's cash or whether it's debt or whether it's a combination of it. Then I'm open to looking at all of those options. What's been there since when C was first presented to us is that unknown amount of additional cuts. So my request is, what are the cuts? I'm not expecting it tonight. I'm not trying to put anybody on spot, but I just think that's what everybody that calls me wants to know. What are those cuts and exactly where are they coming from if it's not that? So my only request is to please identify the cuts. The sooner the better, so that staff will know what to look at and move forward.
Chairman Poole,
That's my only comment.
I would answer that. I was working through completing this plan in October and meeting with different people and was told that it was too time consuming. A couple of weeks ago when you had your, I don't know what to call it, I'll just call it your personal moment, you said that I was occupying too much of the staff's time. And Mike had said that we have a very specific budget process. And so listening to both of you two, I wanted to honor that budget process. And now it seems like it's constantly used against me that I did what you asked me to do. I think that where we sit right now, the plan before we started talking about Plan C was to go borrow a bunch of money and raise people's taxes. We are not prohibited from borrowing a bunch of money and raising people's taxes if we go down this path and see what we can do with respect to Plan C. So I think that instead of voting on something that we really, as Ms. Dubois said, we don't have very good information on, I think we should go through the budget process. As County Manager Mike Downs said, we should go through the budget process. We should talk about these things. We can get the surplus figured out, because I think that we're going to have an opportunity there to avoid most of these cuts by using our surplus, as we had in the last 4 years. And that will give us a great opportunity to sit down and look at what a budget really looks like. We're always going to have the opportunity to go borrow a bunch of money and raise people's taxes. It's not like we were going to borrow the money from the bond this year anyway. It required a tax increase in 2017 to pay back those funds. So the last time that we were going to be able, the earliest time we were going to be able to borrow those funds anyway was the spring of 2016, because there's a 6-month wait period in which you have a wait period to pay those back. So the earliest time we could borrow the money is 2016 anyway in the spring. We are not prejudiced from being able to go borrow money and raise taxes. So let's work through the budget process and see how it works out.
I agree that the indication that I got was that staff was spending a lot of time and not being able to get done their regular duties, and that was why the request was made to back off. That's all I can say on that one. That's what I was told. I just know that that plan's been out there, and there's a continual talk about there's got to be some cut somewhere, and that's just what everybody's asking me. I can't answer the question. E&F were done as a result of the motion that was made and passed, and so that's why that's there. Staff has given us not what they want to cut, but just some examples. Go with it or not. I'm just, to do that, it says there's a cut, and it's going to have to come from somewhere. And we're going to go through the budget process, yes. If we get through May and there's still $7 million worth of cuts to make it work, or whatever the amount of cuts are, that needs to be identified. And I just think everybody's asking for it as soon as things can be identified. So that's. Well, I can't identify $7 million worth of cuts, and so I just.
Can I make a motion to take this off of the agenda for our meeting on Monday, so that we can go through the budget process and actually work with our staff in order to identify what our surplus will look like and identify where we might be able to find some of these?
I think, can you tell me Robert's Rules of Order? We've already approved the agenda for Monday. Would we make a motion on Monday if we're going to amend that agenda? I'm just asking for Robert's Rules.
Well, I don't know that Robert's Rules would apply so much as it's what the board wants to do collectively with reference to that. I think there was some discussion about there not being any business transacted as such at this, other than to receive information. If the board chooses to handle that differently, I think they're within their power to do so. I don't know that you would want to change the agenda for Monday until you get to Monday necessarily.
That's what I was
As far
thinking.
as
On
that
changing the
goes.
agenda, since we've already adopted the agenda, wouldn't we, if there was, which is what I think I just heard, we would change the agenda on Monday if that was the choice to change
That's
the agenda.
typically one of the things you do at the
Yeah,
start of the
we
meeting.
normally do the
so,
agenda where you could make changes
And
at
that
the
could
time.
certainly be done at that point.
Can I make a motion to table this so that we can go through our budget process?
Again, today was just a presentation as requested. I mean, there wasn't a, I think that if you want to take it off the agenda or table it, that should be done on Monday. Which I don't think it's a big deal, but I think it should be done Monday since that agenda's already been approved and published. That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
I mean,
The idea today was that we weren't going to do any
Yeah.
business. That's,
county manager said
Yeah.
specifically, they have a budget process. I've been trying to honor that request and let him work through that budget process, but I don't know that it makes a lot of sense for us to sit and continue to spin our wheels talking about these things when we do have a budget process and we're going to get an opportunity to talk to all of our departments about it.
on Monday, what I would request is on Monday when we begin the meeting and approve an agenda, that you make a motion right then, if that's the case. I just think that makes, I don't know, just from being in meetings, that seems to be the logical thing for me, because we had advertised that this would not have any, we weren't going to do anything in this meeting. We weren't going to make any motions this meeting. Which will make me laugh about the next thing that you wrote down that you want me to mention.
No, just think about it for Monday. Just
Okay.
think about the dates.
Okay. The note that I have from the county manager is, which we talked about at the last meeting, is, are you still planning to go? I'm sorry, I don't mean to call you out, but I know you've gone to Raleigh most times. Are you planning to go for the legislative day? Have you decided yet? Okay. In the event, I think, I'm sorry, I don't remember. Were you planning on going to legislative day? Okay. So legislative day, we already have a work session scheduled, a budget work session scheduled. We need to make a decision on that when we would meet if we didn't meet that night. What Mike suggested is that it would be just the June work session. Is that what you
Yeah,
said before we started?
Well, we could attempt to keep you still have one on the 27th and the 29th. The 28th would be the one rescheduled. We could try to keep the agenda short for other business and just use the majority of that work session as a budget session. That's, since it's already on your calendar.
So I'm not asking if you make a decision now, but
gotta-
can you think about that?
Yeah, what days of the week are those?
Tuesday and Thursday. The 27th is a Tuesday, the 29th is a Thursday. The 28th is the legislative day, assembly day in Raleigh.
Right. So the idea would be we just eliminate a meeting and just put whatever else shift, and it would be the 5th, May 5th, to wrap up those budget meetings. June something, sorry.
First Monday in June.
Sorry, I don't have a calendar in front of me. Just to think about which way you want to handle it, because I know you have gone in the past and enjoyed going up there, so that's why I did. I'm not trying to indicate that you're going or not going, but I know I can't go that day, and I think you said you couldn't go. And Jason, I think you said you weren't planning on it, so. But want to give that opportunity for anybody that needed that opportunity, so.
June 2nd.
Okay.
June 2nd.
June 2nd, thank you. Nice to have the phone calendar. Okay. All we need is a motion to adjourn then, I think. I'm sorry, anybody else want to make comments? I don't want to cut anybody off. Do you want to make a motion? Do we have a second? Second by Chris. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay. Good night.